Tonight, we will embark on a journey spanning 3,000 years, traversing the sands of time to a civilization that has captivated humanity for 1,000 years. This is the complete story of ancient Egypt, from the earliest sprouts of life along the Nile to the last breath of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh to rule the pyramids. This is a story about a divine king and a humble peasant, about towering monuments and graves buried deep underground. They are so obsessed with the afterlife that they have turned death into an art form. It will witness the rise and fall of dynasties. The construction of these wonders still puzzles engineers to this day. People believe that their pharaohs were living gods, and so was their daily life. If this in-depth exploration of history can help you relax after a long day, please feel free to give it a thumbs up and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Please tell me in the comments where you are listening and what time it is now. When the modern world is slumbering beside us, exploring the ancient mysteries brings a strange sense of comfort. Settle down, let the troubles of the day disappear, and let's embark on an epic journey through the history of ancient Egyptian civilization, from prehistoric villages along the Nile to the Roman conquests that ended 3,000 years of Iron rule. We will explore every dynasty, every victory, and every disaster that shaped this extraordinary civilization. This river already existed before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, and even before the concept of Egypt as we know it. The Nile River, this huge water snake that meanders through the heart of Africa, is the most important factor in creating one of the most enduring civilizations in history. To understand ancient Egypt, you must first understand the Nile River. It is more than just a river. It is a lifeline, a calendar, a deity, and a highway. Everything is one. Without the Nile, Egypt would merely be an extension of the Sahara Desert. Endless and dunes stretch from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the center of Africa. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus once called Egypt the gift of the Nile. He is not poetic. He is stating a geological fact. Every year, the Nile River floods like a clock, depositing abundant black silt in the river valley. This annual flood transformed a narrow desert into the most fertile farmland in the ancient world. Imagine such a picture. You are now standing on the edge of the Nile Valley about 6,000 years ago. To your east and west lies an endless stretch of sandy beaches and rocks, scorched by the scorching sun. An unprepared traveler could lose his life within hours. But here, along the river, the land is green and lush. Palm trees sway gently in the breeze, birds chirp among the reeds, and the air is filled with the hope of life. The earliest people to settle along the Nile were not Egyptians. This kind of identity recognition takes thousands of years to form. They weren't nomadic tribes. Due to the gradual drying up of the Sahara Desert, they were forced to move to the riverbank. About 8,000 years ago, the largest desert in the world today was actually a vast green prairie, buttered with lakes and crisscrossed by rivers. However, with the change of climate, these early ethnic groups were forced to abandon their traditional hunting grounds and gather around the only reliable water source minus the Nile. At first, these settlements were small and scattered. Archaeological evidence from places like Narmer shows us hunter-gatherer communities that were just beginning to experiment with agriculture. They built simple stone circles, which were some of the earliest observatories in the world, to track the movement of stars and predict annual floods. Floods are everything. That usually begins in July when summer rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands causes the water level of the Blue Nile to rise, and the Blue Nile converges with the White Nile at today's Khartoum. The merged water will flow northward and reach the first waterfall at the Swan in late July or early August. From there on, the flood will spread throughout the valley, turning the entire landscape into a huge shallow lake. For 3 months, the land will remain underwater. Then, as the flood recedes, it will leave behind a rich layer of black mud, so fertile that farmers can grow crops effortlessly. The Egyptians call this black soil Kemet, which has also become one of the names of their country. For them, the annual flood miracle proved that God favored their land more than anything else. But the Nile River is not merely a water source and fertile soil. It is also a highway in Egypt. This river flows from south to north, but the prevailing wind blows from north to south. This means that ships can go upstream with the wind and downstream with it. This is a perfect transportation system, as if it were designed by God himself. Centuries passed, and the scattered settlements along the Nile River began to merge into larger communities. Villages develop into towns, towns develop into cities, and cities develop into kingdoms. Around 4000 BC, two completely different cultures emerged. To the south is Upper Egypt, centered around the city of Polis, and to the north is Lower Egypt, centered around the Nile Delta. These are not merely geographical divisions, they are also cultural and political issues. Upper Egypt was more conservative and more bound by ancient traditions. Its symbol is a white crown, and its guardian deity is the vulture Nekhbet. Lower Egypt has become more internationalized and more open to external influences. Its symbol is the red crown and its guardian deity is the cobra Vajayat. For centuries, these two kingdoms have existed side by side, sometimes trading and sometimes fighting, but always separated. Their artistic styles vary, their religious customs are different, and their political systems have also developed along different paths. Egypt seems to be in a state of division forever, but around 3100 BC, everything changed. A king from Upper Egypt, whose name might have been Nile, despite some sources referring to him as a threat, initiated a movement to unify two pieces of land under one crown. The details of this conquest have been forgotten by history, but its consequences are far minus reaching. For the first time, the entire Nile Valley from the first waterfall to the Mediterranean Sea was under unified rule. The unification of Egypt was not merely a political event. This is a cultural revolution. The term Mu Pharaoh originally meant great house, referring to the royal palace. He wore two crowns, symbolizing his rule over two countries. He established a new capital in Memphis, strategically located at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. Most importantly, he created a new ideology of monarchy that would last for 3000 years. A pharaoh is not merely a king, he is a god. Specifically, he is the living incarnation of Horus, the eagle-headed god and the son of Osiris, the god of the dead. When the pharaoh died, he became Osiris himself and ruled the afterlife, while his successor played the role of Horus. This sacred monarchy granted the pharaoh absolute power over his subjects and provided the ideological foundation for one of the most stable political systems in history. But even though Egypt was politically unified, its culture was shaped by the rhythm of the Nile River. The annual flood creates a natural calendar that divides the year into 3 seasons. Ket is the flood, Pur is the growing season, and Shimu is the harvest season. This agricultural cycle became the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, influencing everything from religious festivals to administrative practices. The flood also established a unique relationship between the Egyptians and their environment. Unlike other ancient peoples who generally regarded nature as hostile and unpredictable, the Egyptians believed that their world was basically kind. The Nile River provides them with water regularly year after year. The sun rises and sets, always the same. Even death was not an end in the Egyptian worldview, but a transformation. This is a journey to the afterlife, essentially an idealized version of life along the Nile. This optimistic worldview has shaped Egypt's culture for thousands of years. This explains their obsession with order and stability, their meticulous preparations for the afterlife, and their faith in the divinity of the pharaohs. The Nile not only gave them life, but also provided them with a way to understand life, a way that will prove to be very enduring. When we stand at the beginning of Egyptian history and watch the first pharaoh with a double crown on his head, we can already see the seeds of everything that follows. Pyramids, mummies, golden rehes, powerful armies. All of this began the moment when the gifts of the Nile were first unified under a sacred ruler. This river, which nurtured scattered hunter-gatherer tribes, became the pillar of the longest-lasting civilization in human history. The gift of the Nile is about to become a wonder of the world. If you want to know when ancient Egypt truly became ancient Egypt and when it transformed from a bunch of settlements in the Nile River basin into the civilization that still attracts our imagination today, the answer lies in the Old Kingdom, approximately between 2700 and 2200 BC. In this era, the pharaohs became gods, and stones replaced mud bricks. The Egyptians built such magnificent monuments, which are still regarded as a wonder of the world to this day. The Old Kingdom began around 2680 BC during the Third Dynasty. At that time, a pharaoh named Joseph believed that the traditional lod-minus brick must-be tombs of his predecessors were not impressive enough for a divine king. He entrusted his architect, a wise man named Imhotep, to design something unprecedented, a tomb that could lead directly to heaven. What Imhotep created at Saqqara was revolutionary. The stepped pyramid, the world's first monumental stone structure. It wasn't built all at once. More precisely, it evolved from the traditional mastaba, extending outwards by 6 different steps, and reaching a height of over 200 feet. Around the pyramid is a huge and complex courtyard, church and ritual buildings, all of which are surrounded by a wall over a mile long. So the stepped pyramid is not merely an impressive tomb. This is a statement. It declared to the world that Egypt had entered a new era. In that era, the pharaohs held vast resources and were capable of moving mountains. Building the pyramids required thousands of workers, millions of stones and decades of labor. This is an undertaking that only a civilization that has reached an unprecedented level in terms of organization, wealth and technology can undertake. Imhotep himself also became a legend. He is not only an architect but also a doctor, a priest and a scholar. Later generations revered him as the god of medicine and wisdom. He represents the emergence of a group of well-educated professionals who will become the backbone of the Egyptian government. Scribes, engineers and officials created the divinity of the pharaohs, which will manifest in the material world. The success of Joseph's pyramid inspired his successors to have greater ambitions. The Fourth Dynasty, which began around 2600 BC, gave birth to the most famous monument in human history minus the pyramids of Giza. The first one was built by Pharaoh Khufu, who the Greeks called Chaos. Later, it was called the Great Pyramid, and it was an ambitious project. It was originally 481 feet tall and remained the tallest building in the world for over 3,800 years. It contains approximately 3 million stones, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. From this perspective, imagine today's attempt to build the Great Pyramid. You need to collect, transport and precisely locate a piece every 2 minutes, working 24 hours a day for 20 consecutive years. This was accomplished through copper tools, wooden sleds and human labor. No cranes, no bulldozers, no modern machinery at all. The precision of the Great Pyramid is equally astonishing. Its bottom is only 2.1 centimeters horizontal. Its side is aligned with the basic direction with an accuracy of 360 degrees. The tilt angle of the pyramid is 51-52 minutes, establishing a perfect mathematical relationship between its height and the circumference at its base. This is not merely engineering. This is the manifestation of sacred geometry on the stone. But how did they manage to do it? This problem has perplexed historians and engineers for centuries. We know that they use ramps, possibly a combination of straight ramps and spiral ramps, which surround the pyramid during its ascent. We know that they used copper tools, wooden levers and ropes to move these huge stones. We know that they have a workforce of approximately 20,000 to 30,000 people, including skilled craftsmen, laborers and support staff. It is worth noting that these laborers were not composed of slaves, as Hollywood movies make you believe. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed the remains of a workers' village near the pyramids, including bakeries, breweries and medical facilities. The workers ate well and word, even bread, beer, onions and garlic every day. They were organized into teams and named after names like Cuff's friend and the conquered Manon, which indicated that they had a sense of pride and comradeship in their work. These workers are engaged in what they consider sacred. The pyramid is not merely a tomb. This is a resurrection machine, a device used to turn the deceased pharaoh into a god and ensure his eternal rule over Egypt. Every stone they placed, every corridor they carved, and every room they built was part of a cosmic plan at maintaining the sacred order of Egypt and ensuring its prosperity and security. Following the Great Pyramid, Giza has 2 more pyramids. One is the Pyramid of Khafre, the son of Khuf, and the other is the Pyramid of Narmer, Khafre's successor. They built a cemetery together with the Sphinx, a mysterious guardian deity as the eternal home of the king of the Egyptian gods. The Sphinx itself is a mystery. It is carved from a single piece of limestone, measuring 240 feet in length and 66 feet in height. Its face has been weathered by wingdance and 4,000 of years and is believed to represent Pharaoh Khafre, although some theories suggest that it might be older. The Sphinx has been buried and excavated many times throughout history, and it has always carefully kept its secret. The pyramids of Giza are merely the pinnacle of the pyramid Linus building tradition that spans the entire Old Kingdom. The pharaoh built the pyramids in Saqqara, Dashur, Meidum and Dabusir. Each one is a unique architectural and engineering experiment, as the Egyptians improved their techniques and broke through the boundaries of possibility. The curved pyramid of Dashur was built by Pharaoh Khafre, indicating that the Egyptians learned from their mistakes. The angle of the pyramid was changed upwards by half, forming a unique coved appearance. This might be because the initial angle was too steep, and the pyramid began to collapse under the effect of its own weight. Rather than starting anew, the builders merely changed their perspective and keep moving forward. A practical solution created one of the most distinctive monuments in Egypt. The Red Pyramid, also built by Pharaoh, represents the perfection of pyramid building techniques. This is the first true pyramid, smooth and geometrically perfect. It was the prototype of the Great Pyramid, proving that the Egyptians had mastered the art of large scale stone architecture. The Old Kingdom was not just about pyramids. This was also the era when Egyptian art, literature and culture reached their peak for the first time. The walls of the tombs in the ancient kingdom are covered with scenes of daily life, so detailed and vivid that they are a window to a world that vanished 4,000 years ago. We saw farmers plowing the fields to harvest grains, fishermen casting nets on the Nile River, artisans processing gold and copper, ware scribes recording transactions, and nobles enjoying exquisite banquets. These scenes are not merely decorations. They are magical, designed to ensure that the deceased can enjoy all the pleasures of earthly life after death. The Old Kingdom also witnessed the development of Egyptian hieroglyphics into a complex system capable of recording everything from royal decrees to love poems. The pyramid inscriptions carved on the walls of the pyramids in the Old Kingdom are among the oldest religious inscriptions in the world. They gave us the first detailed understanding of the Egyptians' beliefs about death, resurrection and the afterlife. These texts reveal a complex myth centered on Osiris, who was murdered by his brother Seth, dismembered and then resurrected by his wife Isis. The deceased pharaoh became Osiris, and his successor became Horus, Osiris' son. This myth provides a theological basis for the Egyptian monarch and explains how sacred power was passed from one pharaoh to the next. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom ruled Memphis, a city located at the border between Upper and Lower Egypt. Memphis is more than just a capital. This is a sacred city, the home of the god Potter, who is believed to have created the world through his words. The temples, palaces, and administrative buildings of the city make it one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the ancient world. But perhaps what is most notable about this ancient kingdom is its stability. For more than 500 years, Egypt has enjoyed unprecedented peace, prosperity, and cultural achievements. The sacred authority of the pharaoh is beyond doubt. The Nile River has stable floods every year, and Egypt's borders are safe and free from foreign invasions. This stability is built on a complex management system, which the Egyptians call Ma'at, a concept that encompasses truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. This is not merely a legal principle, this is a religious obligation. The pharaoh was responsible for maintaining the mightiest of the entire kingdom, ensuring that the cosmic order of the Nile's flood and the rising sun would be maintained forever. The management of this sacred order requires an army composed of officials, scribes, and bureaucrats. Egypt was divided into administrative regions known as poblins, each of which was governed by a nomarch who was directly accountable to the pharaoh. These officials collected taxes, organized labor gangs for public works projects, maintained irrigation systems, and ensured that the pharaoh's was carried out in every corner of the kingdom. This highly efficient administrative management has led to an astonishing amount of wealth flowing into the national treasury. Egypt controlled the trade route between Africa and the Mediterranean, exporting gold, ivory, ebony and exotic animals in exchange for cedar wood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The pharaoh's workshop produced luxury goods of unparalleled quantity, including jewelry, furniture, weapons and ritual items, showcasing the craftsmanship of Egypt to the world. So this golden age cannot last forever. By the end of the 6th dynasty, around 2180 BC, cracks began to appear on the seemingly perfect appearance of the Old Kingdom. The last great pharaoh of this period was Pepi II, who reigned for an astonishing 93 years, making him the pharaoh with the longest reign in Egyptian history. The long-lasting dominance of Pepi's fragrance, although initially a sign of stability, eventually became the root of weakness. As the pharaoh grew older, his authority began to decline. The nomarchs, who became wealthy and powerful during the prosperous period of the Old Kingdom, began to advocate for their independence. Local governors began to build their own armies, establish their own trade relations, and even formulate their own foreign policies. Meanwhile, Egypt is confronted with environmental challenges which will test the resilience of its civilization. The annual flood of the Nile River, which has been so reliable for centuries, is beginning to decrease. A series of low-line floods, possibly caused by climate change in the Ethiopian highlands, have led to widespread famine and social unrest. The well-maintained irrigation system fell into disrepair over time, and agricultural production plummeted. Facts have proved that the combination of political division and environmental crisis has made it difficult for this ancient kingdom to survive. When Pepi finally died before 2184 AD, Egypt was plunged into chaos. The central government lost control. The Novak declared independence, and the unified kingdom that had lasted for over 800 years split into competing factions. This collapse marked the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a dark age of civil war, famine and social unrest that lasted for more than 150 years. The pyramids still stand, a silent monument to a golden age that seems out of reach, but the civilization that built them appears to be dying out. However, even when it collapsed, this ancient kingdom established some patterns and precedents that would shape Egyptian civilization over the next 2,500 years. The concept of the divine monarchy, an administrative system based on Goths, artistic and architectural styles, and religious beliefs centered on the afterlife. All of these survived the chaos of the First Intermediate Period and were revived in later dynasties. The pyramids themselves have become a symbol of Egypt's eternal nature. Long after the pharaohs who built them were forgotten, the pyramids still inspire awe and amazement. They reminded the Egyptians of future generations that their ancestors had achieved great accomplishments and that they could achieve great accomplishments again. In a sense, the pyramids became Egypt's promise to itself, proving with stones that what had been built before could be built again. As we watch this ancient kingdom gradually fade away from history, we can see that it has achieved some extraordinary accomplishments. Over the course of 5 centuries, some settlements in the Nile River basin have transformed into a civilization capable of building monuments that last longer than empires. The Egyptians had learned large-scale stone processing to organize tens of thousands of laborers and create art and literature that have influenced human culture for thousands of years. Most importantly, they created a concept of Egypt, a country protected by the gods, ruled by a sacred king, and destined to be great forever. Facts have proved that this notion has endured longer than any pyramid or any dynasty. It survived conquests and collapses, for unrulent civil wars, and has carried the essence of Egyptian civilization over a 3,000-year history. The Old Kingdom came to an end, but Egypt was just beginning. Around 2180 BC, the collapse of the Old Kingdom plunged Egypt into one of the darkest periods in its long history. The First Intermediate Period was approximately from 2180 BC to 250 BC, a time when the foundation of Egyptian civilization seemed to have collapsed. Imagine waking up one morning and finding that everything you took for granted, minus the authority of the pharaoh, the reliability of the Nile flood, the prosperity of your village, and the security in your border, vanished overnight. This was the reality of the Egyptians living in the first intermediate period. This painful period has been passed down in Egyptian literature for several centuries and is regarded as the ultimate cautionary tale after the collapse of the sacred order. The direct cause of the collapse was the death of Pepi II after his reign in 1994, but the underlying problems have accumulated for decades. As local rulers and commoners accumulated wealth and power, the authority of the pharaohs was gradually eroded. The rulers of these places began to no longer see themselves as servants of the pharaoh, but as independent kings. After the death of Pepi II, there was no strong successor to maintain the unity of the kingdom. The 7th and 8th dynasties ruled by Memphis were eerily the shadows of their predecessors in the Old Kingdom. Ancient literature records the 70 kings ruled for 70 days. Perhaps it's a bit exaggerated, but it does reflect the chaos and instability of that period. Meanwhile, the nomads were dividing up Egypt. This country was divided into dozens of competing kingdoms, each centered around a major city and its surrounding areas. These little kings constantly killed each other, turning the Nile Valley into a vast and chaotic world composed of multiple warring countries. Trade collapsed. The irrigation system was in disrepair for a long time, and the strict administrative management structure enabled this ancient kingdom to exist, but political chaos was only part of the story. Egypt is also confronted with an environmental disaster which will test the resilience of its civilization. The Nile River, which had been flooding steadily for centuries, began to dry up. It is possible that climate change in the Ethiopian plateau, the source of the Blue Nile, has led to a series of abnormally low floods, resulting in widespread famine. Ancient classics vividly and in detail describe the horrors of those years. Hakel's Admonition, a literary work that made 8 back to this period, depicts an upside-down world. The earth was turning like a potter's turntable. The servant became the master. This poor man became rich. The nobleman's child was knocked against the wall. Another text, Nefertiti's prophecy, describes Egypt as a place where the Egyptian river is empty. People walked across the river. The land has decreased. Its rulers have increased. It is bare, but its tax revenue is huge. The sun veiled will not shine. When the sun is covered by clouds, no one can survive. These are not merely literary metaphors. They are descriptions of the real situation. Archaeological evidence from this period shows clear signs of malnutrition, social unrest and economic collapse. Cemeteries show that life expectancy has dropped sharply and many settlements have been abandoned as people flee their homes in search of food and safety. The disintegration of centralization also triggered a certain form of cultural revolution. For centuries, pharaohs have been the sole medium between gods and humans. Only the pharaoh can ensure that the deceased are fully prepared for the afterlife. Only pharaohs can maintain the order of the universe and keep Egypt prosperous. But as the authority of the pharaohs was questioned, ordinary Egyptians began to solve problems by themselves. This period witnessed what scholars call the democratization of the afterlife. Spells and rituals that were once reserved only for pharaohs began to appear in the tombs of ordinary nobles and officials. The prophet inscriptions painted inside the wooden coffins enabled the Egyptian middle class to acquire the magical knowledge they needed to successfully navigate the afterlife. This is not merely a religious change. This is a social revolution. The strict hierarchical system of the ancient kingdom with the sacred pharaoh at its peak is being challenged by a more equal worldview. If the pharaoh cannot guarantee prosperity in this life or redemption in the afterlife, then perhaps ordinary people need to take care of themselves. However, even in such chaos, the seeds of revival are being sown. In the southern city of Thebes, a local ruling family is gradually establishing a power base that will eventually reunite Egypt. These Zion princes, who later became the 11th dynasty, understood that the problems of Egypt could not be solved merely through military conquest. They need to restore people's faith in the sacred order which has made Egypt great. The process of unification began around 260 BC, when a Achaean ruler named Menuot Epit launched a movement that brought the entire Egypt under his control. It took him merely 50 years, but in 2010 BC, he successfully unified Upper and Lower Egypt under one king. The victory of the Menuan steppe to mark the beginning of the Central Kingdom. But this is not merely a military victory. This is a cultural and spiritual revival. The new pharaoh understood that he not only needed to restore the political unity of Egypt, but also to rebuild Egypt's confidence in itself. He initiated large minor-scale construction projects, restored the irrigation system, and revived the flourishing artistic and literary traditions of the Old Kingdom period. However, the pharaohs of the Central Kingdom also learned lessons from the mistakes of their predecessors. They established a more centralized administrative system, reduced the power of the nobility, and ensured that local governors were loyal to the king. They also gained a deeper understanding of Egypt's position in the broader world and established trade relations with Nubia, the Levant and Asia. Perhaps most importantly, they created a new ideology of monarchy, acknowledging the lessons of the first intermediate period. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom did not claim to be foolproof gods. They portray themselves as shepherds of the people, taking responsibility for the people's well-being and their failures. Facts have proved that this more humble attitude towards the sacred monarchy is more enduring than the absolute authority claimed by the pharaohs of the ancient kingdom. The literature of the Central Kingdom reflects this new understanding of the royal responsibility. Then On's instructions warned future pharaohs that trusting their subordinates was dangerous. Don't trust your brothers. Don't know any friends. It is of no value not to create intimacy for oneself. The story of Sinai explores the themes of exile and return, reflecting the concern over the fragility of social order during that period. These words reveal a civilization that was traumatized by collapse, but became stronger and wiser. The Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom period understood that their civilization was not guaranteed merely by the grace of God. It requires constant vigilance, careful management, and the active participation of all social strata. The first intermediate period was a time of darkness and despair, but it was also a period of learning and growth. The Egyptians found that their civilization was more resilient than they had imagined. Even if the authority of the pharaohs collapsed, even if the Nile no longer flooded, even if the foundation of their world seemed to have collapsed, the fundamental spirit of Egypt still existed. The pyramids still stand on the Giza Plateau, where the mine is beaten but intact, reminding the Egyptians of the achievements of their ancestors. Hieroglyphics still preserve their sacred texts and retain the wisdom of past eras. The Nile still flows from south to north, and every year's flood carries the hope of revival. Most importantly, the Egyptian concept Minusol, and blessed by the gods and destined to be great Minos, survived the chaos. This idea was refined and strengthened during the Middle Kingdom period, and a more mature and complex understanding of its significance to the Egyptians was achieved. The first intermediate stage has come to an end, but its lessons will never be forgotten. The Egyptians have come to realize that civilization is fragile, prosperity is temporary, and even the sacred king will die. But they also understood that as long as they had wisdom, courage and determination, even the greatest disasters could be overcome. The Dark Ages are over. The Central Kingdom is about to begin. Egypt, under the rule of Menuet was reunified around 210 BC, marking the beginning of what many scholars consider the classical age of Egyptian civilization. During the Middle Kingdom period from 250 BC to 1650 BC, Egypt achieved a remarkable balance between the sacred authority of the pharaohs and the practical need to manage a complex society. If the ancient Egyptian kingdom was establishing the basic models of Egyptian civilization, and the first intermediate period was testing these models until they collapsed, then the Middle Egyptian kingdom was refining and perfecting these models. This was the most mature, self-aware and humanized period in Egypt in many aspects. The pharaohs of the Central Kingdom learned the lessons of their predecessors. They understood that without wisdom or restraint, absolute power might lead to the kind of collapse of the Old Kingdom. They did not claim to be foolproof gods, but depicted themselves as shepherds of the people, responsible for the welfare of Egypt and for its failures. The literary works of this period perfectly interpreted the new way of royal power. Amun-Pu's instructions were advice given by a deceased pharaoh to his son, which indicates that this ruler had a profound understanding of the essence of power. I give alms to beggars and raise orphans. I enable that person who has nothing to reach his goal. Just like him, he was a big shot, but he ate my food, which aroused opposition. The Persianite Rusted used it to conspire. These words did not come from the mouth of a distant divine king, but from a human ruler who had experienced betrayal, disappointment, and responsibility. The pharaohs of the Central Kingdom understood that royal power was not only a privilege, but also a burden, not only an honor, but also a responsibility. This more nuanced understanding of the monarchy was reflected in the administrative reforms of the Central Kingdom. The pharaohs established a more centralized government, weakening the power of the commoners who had caused so much trouble during the first intermediate period. They established a professional civil service system, and the promotion of clerks and officials was based on merit rather than background. The capital was moved from Memphis to a new city called Tovi, which is located near today's Lee. The strategic positioning of this new capital is to control both Upper and Lower Egypt. Its name, meaning Caesar of two lands, declared the pharaoh's determination to maintain unity at all costs. However, the pharaohs of the Central Kingdom did not only focus on internal management, they also turned their attention to the border of Egypt. In the history of Egypt, for the first time, pharaohs began to systematically consider issues of defense and expansion. They built a series of large fortresses along the southern border bordering Nubia, creating a version that was essentially the Great Wall of ancient China. These fortresses, named Buchan, Sem Kuma, are wonders of military engineering. Their features include huge city walls, complex gate systems, and elaborately designed fire scenes that can destroy any attacking force. But they are not merely military facilities. They were also administrative centers, controlling trade between Egypt and Nubia and ensuring that wealth from the south flowed to the north and into the pharaoh's treasury. The motivation for conquering Nubia was not merely military ambition. This is driven by Egypt's insatiable demand for gold. Nubia was rich in gold mines. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom needed this precious metal to fund their construction projects, maintain their armies, and display their wealth to foreign rulers. Nubia's gold became the foundation of Egypt's prosperity during this period. However, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom were also interested in expanding Egypt's influence to the north and east. They established trade relations with the cities of the Levant, importing cedar wood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, and exotic goods from distant Afghanistan. Egyptian merchants and diplomats traveled throughout the eastern Mediterranean, expanding Egypt's influence and bringing foreign ideas back to the Nile Valley. This cosmopolitan perspective is reflected in the art and literature of the Central Kingdom. Influenced by foreign cultures, Egyptian artists began to experiment with new styles and techniques. The rigid form and art of the Old Kingdom gave way to more natural and expressive works. The pharaoh on the statue has a haggard face and a lifelike facial expression, acknowledging that humans shoulder the sacred royal power. Chinese literature is particularly remarkable for its psychological depth and moral complexity. The New Black is perhaps the greatest work in ancient Egyptian literature. It tells the story of a court official who fled Egypt after his pharaoh was assassinated, went into exile among Asians, and eventually returned to his hometown, where he died in his beloved homeland. This story explores the themes of identity, loyalty, and belonging, which resonate across different cultures and centuries. Another masterpiece, The Eloquent Farmer, tells the story of a simple farmer who is robbed by corrupt officials and demands that the authorities seek justice. The farmer's eloquent speeches on fairness and justice impressed the officials so deeply that they postponed the trial just to hear more of his beautiful words. This story is both a celebration of the power of eloquence and a criticism of the judicial system that values style over substance. These literary works reveal that a civilization has reached an astonishing level of maturity in understanding human nature and social relations. The Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom had the ability of irony, self-criticism and psychological insight, which their predecessors of the Old Kingdom did not have. They learned to question authority, examine their own motives, and acknowledge the complexity of moral choices. Extraordinary achievements have been made in mathematics, medicine and engineering, matching this intellectual maturity. The history of this papyrus can be traced back to around 1650 BC, indicating that Egyptian mathematicians had developed sophisticated techniques for solving complex problems involving fractions, geometry and algebra. Edwin Smith's papyrus reveals the detailed understanding of anatomy and surgery by Egyptian doctors, which has been unmatched in Europe for over 2,000 years. The engineering achievements of the Central Kingdom are equally impressive. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, especially Amenhotep II, carried out large-scale irrigation projects, turning the Fayum oasis into one of the most productive agricultural areas in Egypt. They built a complex system of canals and dams to control the flow of the Nile River, forming what the Greeks later called Lake Moeris. These irrigation projects not only require engineering technology, but also complex administrative coordination. Thousands upon thousands of workers must be organized to have enough to eat and live well. The materials must be transported across hundreds of miles of deserts. Local officials must coordinate with central planners. The successful completion of these projects indicates that the Central Kingdom has reached an organizational complexity comparable to that of any ancient civilization. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom also resumed the tradition of building pyramids. Although their pyramids were smaller than those of the Old Kingdom and less technologically ambitious, the Pyramid of Dashur was built by Akhenaten Sen, Reti II, who employed a new technique to repel ironstone shell around a mud-brick core. This method was more economical than the solid stone buildings of the Old Kingdom and reflected a more practical approach of the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. However, perhaps the most significant achievement of the Central Kingdom was the formation of a more inclusive vision for Egyptian society. The democratization of the afterlife that began in the First Intermediate Period continued until the Central Kingdom, where an increasing number of Egyptians obtained spells and rituals to ensure their survival after death. The coffin inscriptions painted inside the wooden coffins enabled the Egyptian middle class to access the magical knowledge that was once known only to the pharaohs. These texts include maps of the afterlife, spells to overcome various dangers, and instructions for navigating through the complex bureaucracy of the deceased. They represent a fundamental transformation of Egyptian religious thought, from a system centered solely on the pharaohs to one that recognizes the spiritual needs of all Egyptians. This religious democratization, accompanied by social change, has provided more Egyptians with opportunities for progress. The professional civil service system established by the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom was based on merit rather than origin, allowing talented people from humble backgrounds to rise to authoritative positions. The expansion of trade and industry created new opportunities for merchants and artisans. The development of cities has provided another option for the traditional agricultural life that has ruled Egypt for thousands of years. However, despite all the achievements made, the Central Kingdom also sowed the seeds of its own decline. The success of the pharaohs in concentrating power and expanding Egypt's borders created new challenges, which eventually proved to be overwhelming. The cost of maintaining Nubian fortresses, the complexity of managing an increasingly diverse population, and the growing threat of foreign invasions have all imposed ultimately unbearable pressure on the system. The first sign of trouble emerged during the reign of Amama IV, approximately 1810 AD. After the death of the pharaoh, there was no male heir. The power was passed on to his sister or daughter, Sebit nephew, who became one of the few women who ruled Egypt as the pharaoh with her own rights. Her reign was both brief and chaotic. When she died around 1886 BC, the Central Kingdom began to decline slowly. The subsequent 13th dynasty was characterized by political instability and weak rulers. As local officials advocated independence, the most powerful central administrative system of the Central Kingdom began to disintegrate. Nubian fortresses were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, and Egypt's control over the southern territory began to weaken. Meanwhile, Egypt is facing new external pressures. The Asian people, known as the Hikos by the Egyptians, are increasingly migrating to the Nile Delta. At first, these immigrants were welcomed as merchants and artisans, but as their numbers grew, they began to challenge Egypt's authority in the north. A new technology brought by the Hyksos people will completely transform the wars in the ancient world. Horse-drawn chariots, compound bows, improved bronze weapons. These innovations gave them a clear advantage in military terms over the Egyptians, who still used traditional weapons and tactics. Around 1650 BC, the Hyksos established their own kingdom in the Nile Delta, with their capital in Ares. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Egypt was ruled by foreigners. The Middle Kingdom came to an end, and Egypt entered another period of division and unrule, which historians call the Second Intermediate Period. The legacy of the Central Kingdom will continue. The administrative system, literary tradition, artistic style and religious innovation of this period were all restored and improved in later dynasties. The Central Kingdom has demonstrated that Egyptian civilization can learn from its mistakes, adapt to new challenges, and become stronger during times of crisis. Most importantly, the Central Kingdom created a more mature and complex understanding of what the Egyptians were. During this period, the pharaohs had learned to balance the authority of the gods and the responsibilities of humanity, combining traditional values with practical innovations to create a society that was both stable and vibrant. As the Central Kingdom gradually faded from history, it left a template for Egypt's greatness that will inspire future generations. The classical age has come to an end, but its achievements will echo for centuries, reminding the later Egyptians of what their civilization could achieve when wisdom and strength, tradition and innovation, sacred authority and human compassion were combined. The Hyksos may have ruled the north, but the Egyptian ideology, refined and perfected during the Middle Kingdom period, remained unbroken in the south, waiting for the right moment to reaffirm itself and regain its due status as the greatest civilization of the ancient world. Around 1650 BC, the collapse of the Central Kingdom ushered in another period of division and foreign rule, which would once again test Egypt's ability to recover. The Second Intermediate Period, approximately from 1650 to 1550 AD, was marked by the rise of the Akhenaten dynasty. The Akhenaten dynasty was a foreign ruler who controlled northern Egypt for over a century, fundamentally altering the essence of Egyptian civilization. The word Hyksos comes from the Egyptian word Hiksut, meaning the ruler of foreign lands. They were not a single ethnic group, but an alliance composed of Asians, Canaanites, Amorites and people from other generations who migrated to the Nile Delta. At first, they came to Egypt as merchants, artisans and laborers, and were welcomed by the Egyptians because of their skills and foreign goods. However, as their numbers grew and the central authority of Egypt weakened, they began to assert political control in the areas where they had settled. The rise of the Hyksos people was attributed to their advanced military technology. They brought about innovations and revolutionary changes to ancient warfare: horse-drawn chariots, compound bows, improved bronze weapons, and new siege techniques. Egyptians, who had relied on traditional infantry tactics for centuries, were completely defeated by these new military technologies. The psychological impact of conquering Chico might be greater than the military impact. For over 1,000 years, the Egyptians have always believed that their land was specially blessed by the gods, and the natural barriers of deserts and oceans protected them from foreign invasions. The idea that foreigners could not only invade Egypt, but also rule it was almost incomprehensible to the Egyptians' worldview. The Chico people established their capital in Ava, or is in the eastern delta, which later became one of the largest and most international cities in the ancient world. During the archaeological excavation at the ancient Ava, or as site of Tyre al-Dababa, a city with distinct Egyptian features was discovered. Asian-style houses for pottery and evidence of horse burials, a practice completely different from the Egyptian tradition. However, the Hyksos were not merely foreign conquerors who imposed their will on the conquered people. They were very adaptable rulers. They understood that if they wanted to maintain their rule, they needed to adapt to the traditions and beliefs of Egypt. Many rulers of the high Kos adopted the royal titles of Egypt, built temples for the Egyptian gods, and employed Egyptian scribes and administrators. The most famous ruler of the Chicos was Chen, whose name was inscribed on monuments as far as Caire and Mesopotamia, indicating that the Chicos maintained a wide trading network in the eastern Mediterranean. Another renowned ruler was Abus, who engaged in diplomatic correspondence with King Kush of Nubia, attempting to form an alliance to squeeze the remaining Egyptian rulers in the south. But while the High Khs were in control of the north, the pharaohs of Egypt continued to rule the south from their capital. These the Ban rulers formed the 17th dynasty. They were initially content with paying tribute to the High Kos and maintaining independence in Upper Egypt. However, as time went by, they began to feel annoyed under Pharaohs and dreamed of reunifying Egypt under local rule. The tense relationship between the High Kos and Pharaoh Thebes is illustrated in the famous literary work The Quarrel between Apep and Senlay. According to this story, King Abos of Chicos sent a message to Pharaoh Sach in Rate of Thebes, complaining that the noise from hippos and thieves kept him awake at night. While Avarice was hundreds of miles away from the bandits, this was clearly an excuse for the conflict, an insult aimed at provoking the rebellion of the Ban rulers. Whether this story is true or not, we all know that the Second Dynasty aided wage war against the Hyksos. His mummy was discovered in the 19th century. There is evidence that there were severe wounds on his head, which might have been caused by the weapons of the Hyksos. It seemed that he died on the battlefield, but his sacrifice was not in vain. It initiated the War of Liberation and eventually drove the Hyksos out of Egypt. The war was continued by Chemis, the son of Enraii, who launched a series of campaigns against Hyksos strongholds in central Egypt. The war proclamation carved by Ocean Staley at Karnak provides a vivid description of these battles. I sailed north because I was powerful enough to attack Asians through the power of the moon and the justice of the parliament. My valiant army stands before me, like a ball of fire. But it was Kamoshi's brother Akhemos, who ultimately accomplished the liberation of Egypt. Akhenaten established the 18th dynasty and is regarded as the first pharaoh of the new kingdom. In the early years of his reign, he systematically reduced the Hyksos strongholds throughout the delta. The final siege of Ava was a long process. But when the city finally fell before 1550 AD, Yan's rule in Egypt also came to an end. The expulsion of the Hyksos was not merely a military victory. This is a cultural and psychological victory that will reshape Egyptian civilization in the coming centuries. The Egyptians have come to realize that their land is not impregnable and for an invasion is possible. They need to be prepared to resist external threats. This new understanding led to fundamental changes in Egypt's military organization and strategy. The pharaohs of the new kingdom will establish the first professional army in Egyptian history, equipped with the same advanced weapons as the initial advantages of the Hyksos. They will also adopt an aggressive Pharaoh policy, conquer the territories of Nubia and the Levant, and establish buffer zones to protect Egypt from future invasions. However, the Chicos period also had a positive impact on Egyptian civilization. Foreign rulers brought new technologies, new ideas and new cultural influences, enriching Egyptian society. The horses and chariots invented by the Chico people became symbols of the power of ions. New musical instruments, artistic techniques and literary forms all entered Egyptian culture during this period. Perhaps most importantly, the Chicos period forced Egyptians to become more international and extroverted. The early state of isolation in Egyptian history is no longer possible. In this world, foreigners can cross the ocean and establish kingdoms far from their homeland. If Egyptians want to maintain their independence and prosperity, they need to have contact with the broader world. The Second Intermediate Period also witnessed the significant development of Egyptian religion. During the Middle Kingdom period, Amon was a relatively minor deity that rose to power in the struggle against the Hyksos. The pharaohs of Tai and attributed their victory to Ammon. When they unified Egypt, they regarded him as the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon. The Mon eventually merged with his son, Ra, and became the king of the gods Amon. This period also witnessed the continuous democratization of religion in Egypt. During this period, the Book of the Dead was widely circulated, collecting spells and guidance leading to the afterlife. But like the early pyramid texts and coffin texts, which were limited to the royal family and nobility, the Book of Death can be purchased by anyone who can afford it, further expanding the access to the magical knowledge needed for immortality. The art and literature of the Second Intermediate Period reflected the trauma and uncertainty of foreign rule. The writings of this period often express nostalgia for the glorious past and hope for recovery in the future. Cleopatra's admonition can be traced back to this period. It describes an upturned world where the land turns like a potter's wheel and servants become masters. However, even in the darkest moments of foreign rule, Egyptian culture demonstrated astonishing resilience. Hieroglyphics continue to be used. The religious customs of Egypt are being preserved, and the basic structure of Egyptian society has remained unchanged. The Hyksos might have ruled Egypt, but they did not destroy it. When Amos finally expelled the last ruler of Hyksos and reunified Egypt under local rule, he was not merely restoring the old order, he is creating something new. The new kingdom that rose from the ashes of the Second Intermediate Period would be more militaristic, more international and more powerful than any previous Egyptian dynasty. The pharaohs of the new kingdom will learn from the successes and failures of their predecessors. They will combine the complex governance of the central kingdom with the grand ambitions of the old kingdom, while incorporating new elements borrowed from foreign enemies. They established an empire that extended from Nubia to the Euphrates River, making Egypt the ruling power of the ancient world for more than 4 centuries. That they will never forget the lessons of the Hyksos. Egypt was highly vulnerable to foreign invasions, a realization that prompted them to remain vigilant at all times and expand actively. A memory of foreign rule would make them suspicious of outsiders and determined to maintain the purity of Egyptian culture. The trauma of the Second Intermediate Period will affect Egypt's foreign policy for the remainder of the Pharaonic era. When Amos wore the double crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt on his head, he was not merely a pharaoh. He is becoming the creator of a new type of Egyptian monarchy. The pharaohs of the new kingdom will be valiant kings, conquerors and empire builders, and they will make Egypt the most powerful country in the ancient world. The era of isolation is over. The age of empires is about to begin. Around 1550 BC, Amos I expelled the Hyksos, marking the beginning of the most glorious period in Egyptian history. This new kingdom, which lasted from 1550 BC to 1070 BC, was the imperial era of Egypt. During this period, the armies commanded by the pharaohs marched from Nubia all the way to the Euphrates River. Egyptian gold circulated through the international trade network, and the names of the Egyptian kings were known and feared from Anatolia to the center of Africa. Here lies the golden treasure of Tutankhamun, the colossal monuments of Rome, and the magnificent temple of Hatshepsut in the beloved El Boshi. In that era, Egypt was not merely surviving in a perilous world. It ruled that world, imposing its will on enemies and allies to military power, diplomatic skills and pure cultural prestige. This transformation began with Amos himself, who understood that the expulsion of the Hyksos was only the first step to ensure Egypt's future. The pharaohs of ancient and medieval kingdoms were content to rule within the traditional boundaries of Egypt, relying on natural barriers to protect them from external threats. But the invasion of Hyksos shattered this illusion of security. If Egypt wants to remain independent, it needs to control the territories that may be invaded in the future. Amos first pursued Hyksos and fled to Palestine, besieged their strongholds, and ensured that they would no longer pose a threat to Egypt. But his successor went further and established an empire that stretched from the 4 falls of the Nile in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. The founder of this empire was Thomas I, who ruled Rome from 1479 to 1425 AD. Tutmosis II was later known as the Napoleon of Egypt. During his 50-year reign, he personally led the army to participate in 17 military operations and achieved victories, making Egypt the dominant force in the ancient Near East. The most famous victory of Tutmosis II occurred in the Battle of Mediga in 1457 BC, where he defeated the union of Canaanite princes who were resisting Egyptian rule. The records of the pharaoh's battles engraved on the walls of the Karnak temple read like an ancient military manual. The king led the infantry and chariots northward. The good road leading to Aruna has been taken. His Majesty the King led his army out in person and guided everyone with his footsteps. The victory of the Battle of Medigo paved the way for Egypt's expansion into Syria and Palestine. Ptolemy occupied over 300 cities in his campaigns and brought immense wealth to Egypt in the form of tributes, slaves and foreign commodities. The walls of the Karnak temple were covered with a list of the offerings he had received. Gold comes from Nubia, silver from Anatolia, cedar from Lebanon, horses from Matanai, and exotic animals from Africa and Asia. But the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were not merely conquerors. They are also skilled diplomats who understand that an empire cannot be sustained solely by military power. They developed a complex international relations system based on treaties, marriages, gift exchanges and ambassadors. The Amana letters are a collection of diplomatic correspondence discovered in the ruins of the Akhenaten capital, offering a captivating glimpse into this ancient international political world. These letters reveal the complex web of relationships among the major powers in the ancient Near East. The pharaoh corresponded equally with the king of Babylon, the king of Assyria, the king of Mitanni and the Hittites, regarded them as brothers and negotiated marriages for their children. The smaller rulers of Palestine and Syria wrote to the pharaoh as servants, reporting on the local situation and requesting military support to fight against the enemy. The wealth flowing into Egypt from the Egyptian Empire was astonishing. The gold from the Nubian gold mines, the tributes from the conquered regions, and the profits brought by international trade made the pharaohs of the New Kingdom the wealthiest rulers in the ancient world. This fortune was used to fund large minor-scale construction projects that transformed the landscape of Egypt and created some of the most magnificent monuments in human history. A temple complex dedicated to Amun-Ra in Karnak became the largest religious building in the ancient world. Generation after generation of pharaohs added a huge maze to this complex, consisting of temples, chapels, obelisks and courtyards, covering an area of more than 200 acres. This super minor-style hall, built by Swan and Ramses, has 130 for huge columns, some of which are over 60 feet tall, arranged in 16 rows forming a stone forest. That perhaps the most impressive monument of the New Kingdom is the Abu Sight, two temples carved by Ramses II on the cliffs in southern Nubia. The larger temple has 4 huge statues of pharaohs, each at 60 feet tall, always sitting on their thrones and gazing at the Nile River. The smaller temple was dedicated to Ram's beloved wife, Nefertari, and the goddess Hera. These monuments are not merely expressions of the royal family's self. They are elaborately designed political statements, aiming to impress Egyptian subjects and foreign tourists with the pharaoh's power and wealth. The message conveyed is very clear. Egypt is the greatest civilization in the world, and its pharaohs are the most powerful rulers on earth. The New Kingdom also witnessed the remarkable development of Egyptian art, literature and culture. The early rigid formal style gave way to more natural and expressive works. Artists began to experiment with new technologies to create paintings and sculptures, capturing movements, emotions and personalities in unprecedented ways. The vivid depictions of daily life in the two morals of the New Kingdom period are particularly striking. Nebuchadnezzar was a scribe and grain accountant. In his grave, there are scenes of hunting in the marshland, dining with family and friends, and supervising agricultural work, which offer a close glimpse into the life of the Egyptian middle class. His murals reveal a society that has achieved remarkable prosperity and maturity, where even minor officials can afford exquisite decorations. The literature of the New Kingdom reflects the cosmopolitan view of the imperial era. Egyptian scribes translated foreign texts, adapted foreign stories, and incorporated foreign words into their vocabulary. The story of the two brothers was clearly influenced by Mesopotamian literature, while Venemon's report described an Egyptian official's adventure across the Levant in search of cedar would define the sacred ship of the god Amun. That this new kingdom was also accompanied by religious unrest, which shook the foundation of Egyptian civilization. Around 1350 BC, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV launched a religious revolution, attempting to replace the traditional polytheistic religion of Egypt with the worship of the single god Aten. And Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective against Akhenaten, and moved his capital from Bandit to a new city called Akhenaten, which is today's Amana. He closed the temples of the traditional gods, dismissed their priests, and declared In as the only true god. This is not merely a religious reform. This was a thorough transformation of Egyptian culture and society. The art of the Amana period reflected this revolutionary spirit. The rigid and idealized style of traditional Egyptian art has been replaced by a more natural approach that presents real family members in intimate family settings. Akhenaten is depicted as having a slender skull, feminine hips and a prominent abdomen, features that are unimaginable in traditional royal art. His wife Nefertiti was regarded as his equal companion and sometimes even wore the pharaoh's crown. But Akhenaten's revolution was too radical for Egyptian society to accept. Traditional clergy, the military and ordinary people all opposed this new religion. When Akhenaten died before 1336 AD, his successor soon abandoned his reforms. His capital was abandoned, his monument was destroyed, and his name was erased from official records. The restoration of traditional religion was accomplished by the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun. Howard Carter discovered his tomb intact in 1922, providing us with the most complete picture of the burial customs of the New Kingdom's royal family. There are over 5,000 items in the ancient tomb, including the famous golden death mask, which has become one of the most known cultural relics of ancient Egypt. However, Tutankhamun's reign was short-lived. The true power was restored by the military commander Hormuzd, who established the 19th dynasty and began the process of rebuilding the Egyptian empire. His successor, Sithand Ramses II, restored Egypt from a glory and created some of the most magnificent monuments in Egyptian history. Rome I ruled for 66 years from 1279 to 1213 AD and was perhaps the greatest of all the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. He commanded countless military operations, built more monuments than any other pharaoh, and had over 100 children. His reign marked the peak of Egypt's power and prosperity, but even Ramses the Great was unable to prevent the decline of this new kingdom. Egypt is facing increasing pressure from new enemies. The Sea People, mysterious invaders, attacked the eastern Mediterranean before 1200 AD. Libyans pressuring the western border of Egypt and Nubians gradually advocating independence in the south. The cost of maintaining an empire is becoming increasingly heavy. As the local rulers declared independence, the wealth that had once flowed into Egypt from the conquered territories began to dry up. The priests of Amun-Ra had accumulated so much wealth and power that they began to challenge the authority of the pharaoh himself. By the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1070 BC, this new kingdom had begun to decline. The last great pharaoh, Ramses I, ruled a divided country. The high priest of Amun controlled the south, while the pharaoh's power was limited to the north. The age of empires is coming to an end, but the legacy of this new kingdom will still exist for a long time after its political power wanes. The monuments built during this period, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the tombs in the King's Valley, and the great temples of the Abe symbol will continue to inspire awe and amazement for thousands of years to come. The artistic and literary achievements of this period influenced Egyptian culture during the Pharaonian period. Most importantly, the new kingdom established Egypt's reputation as one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. The pharaohs of this period demonstrated that Egypt could not only survive in a perilous world, but also rule it, imposing its will on both enemies and allies through a combination of military power, diplomatic skills and cultural prestige. The imperial era is coming to an end, but the great memories of Egypt will live on, inspiring future generations to dream of restoring their country to its former glory. When Egypt combined traditional wisdom with imperial ambition, sacred authority with military power, cultural confidence with a global perspective, this new kingdom demonstrated to the world what it could achieve. When the sun falls upon this new kingdom, the legacy it leaves behind will define Egypt's civilization throughout its long history. Egypt may never reach the same level of power and prosperity again, but it will never forget the lessons of the imperial era. In a world full of danger and competition, the importance of military strength, diplomatic skills and cultural confidence. The collapse of the new kingdom around 1070 BC marked the beginning of another period of political division and foreign rule, which historians call the Third Intermediate Period, from 1070 BC to 664 BC. This was an era when the unity of Egypt once again collapsed. Foreign dynasties ruled in the north, while local pharaohs held onto power in the south. The survival of Egyptian civilization seemed to be in a balanced state. The seeds of this collapse were already sown in the final years of the new kingdom. The cost of maintaining the Egyptian empire became increasingly heavy, depleting the royal treasury and the country's resources. The priests of Amun-Ra had accumulated so much wealth and power that they had actually become independent rulers. The foreign invasions by maritime peoples and Libyan tribes weakened Egypt's military power and damaged its reputation. For the last pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, Ramses, died around 1070 BC, Egypt was actually divided. In the north, a new pharaoh dynasty ruled Tanis, a city located in the Nile Delta, which was mainly built with stones taken from the pyramid of the abandoned capital of Ramses. In the south, the high priests of Amun controlled the Thebes and Upper Egypt. They ruled Egypt as pharaohs while maintaining the illusion that they served the kings of the north. This division was formally established in the 21st dynasty, when the pharaohs of Tanis and the priestly kings of Thebes formed a complex co-minus ruling system. The pharaohs in the north controlled Lower Egypt and maintained diplomatic relations with foreign powers, while the priestly kings in the south controlled the wealth of the gold mines in Upper Egypt and Nubia. The marriage between the two royal families helps maintain this delicate balance. But it is obvious that Egypt is no longer the unified and powerful kingdom of the New Kingdom period. The weaknesses of this divided kingdom soon caught the attention of foreign invaders. Before 945 AD, a Libyan chieftain named Pharaohs took control of the northern kingdom and established the 22nd dynasty. Libyans have settled in the Nile Delta for generations, serving as mercenaries in the Egyptian army and gradually integrating into Egyptian society. But Pharaohs could mark the first time since the Hyksos dynasty that foreigners ruled Egypt as pharaohs. Pharaohs, known as his Hak in the Bible, attempted to restore Egypt's former glory through military conquest. Around 925 BC, he successfully launched a campaign in Palestine, ransacked Jerusalem and seized the treasures at the Temple of Solomon. His victory was recorded in Egyptian inscriptions in the Bible, briefly restoring Egypt's prestige in the ancient Near East. But the successor of Pharaohsandpyramids was unable to maintain this momentum. The Libyan dynasty gradually lost control of Upper Egypt. The local rulers advocated independence and established their own kingdom. Before the 8th century AD, Egypt was divided into dozens of competing dynasties, each of which controlled a small piece of territory and called itself a pharaoh. This political division was accompanied by economic recession and cultural stagnation, as resources were transferred to the continuous wars between rival dynasties. The early great construction projects also came to an end. As foreign merchants lost confidence in Egypt's stability, the trade network collapsed. Due to the local rulers' focus on short-term military goals rather than long-term economic development, the irrigation system that has maintained Egyptian agriculture for thousands of years has fallen into disrepair. The art and literature of the Third Intermediate Period reflected this decline. The grand and confident New Kingdom style gave way to smaller and more modest works, which often replicated early models rather than creating new forms. The quality of craftsmanship declined as skilled artisans fled the chaos or were unable to find wealthy patrons. With the closure of scribbling schools and the decline in literacy rates, even hieroglyphics have begun to deteriorate. However, even during this dark period, Egyptian civilization demonstrated extraordinary resilience. The basic structure, administrative system, religious hierarchy and cultural traditions of Egyptian society survived the political chaos. Local rulers continued to build temples, commission statues and fund artists, even on a smaller scale than their predecessors. Egyptian continued to develop and new literary works were created, reflecting the concerns and anxieties of this era. One of the most notable developments during the Third Intermediate Period was the rise of Nubian power in the south. The kingdom of Kush was located in Akhenaten, near the fourth falls of the Nile River, and was a colony of Egypt during the New Kingdom period. However, as the power of Egypt declined, the Nubians gradually advocated independence and began to develop their own unique culture, integrating elements from Egypt and Africa. The Nubian king, who styled himself as the pharaoh and adopted the title of the Egyptian royal family, regarded himself as the true heir of ancient Egyptian civilization. They are devout in religion, loyal to the god Amun-Ra, and committed to restoring the traditional values they believe have made Egypt great. When they looked northward, Egypt had turned into a divided and chaotic kingdom, and they saw an opportunity to fulfill their destiny as the legitimate rulers of the Nile Valley. Around 750 BC, King Peer of Nubia launched a campaign to conquer Egypt in an attempt to restore its ancient glory. His victory was discovered at the Gable of Beryl in Sudan, providing a detailed record of his conquest. He marched northward, overthrew the evil on this land, and enabled the two countries to live in peace. The conquest of P was very successful. One by one, the small kingdoms of Egypt admitted to his authority. The Libyan dynasty in the north was either defeated or won over. The priest king of the Thebes welcomed him as a liberator, and he would restore the normal worship of Amun-Ra. In 728 BC, the pharaohs controlled the entire Egypt from the first falls to the Mediterranean Sea. The conquest of Nubia marked the beginning of the 25th dynasty, also known as the Kushi dynasty. For nearly a century, Egypt was ruled by African black pharaohs who regarded themselves as the restorers of ancient Egyptian civilization. These Nubian pharaohs were more like Egyptians than the Egyptians themselves. They revived the artistic style of the Old Kingdom, restored ancient temples, and promoted traditional religious customs that had been neglected during the chaotic period of the Third Intermediate Period. The most famous Nubian pharaoh was Tahara, who ruled from 690 BC to 664 BC. Tahara was a great architect who built temples in various parts of Egypt and Nubia, including the expansion of the Karnak temple complex, whose works were comparable to those of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. He also attempted to restore Egypt's international prestige by interfering in the politics of the Levant and supported the local rulers in their fight against the increasingly powerful Assyrians. But Tianyuan's ambition led him to conflict with the most powerful empire at that time. The Assyrians, who conquered most of the ancient Near East, regarded Egypt's interference in their sphere of influence as an intolerable threat. In 671 BC, King Esarhaddon of Assyria launched a large minor-scale invasion of Egypt, defeated the army of Tahara and occupied Memphis. The Assyrians' conquest of Egypt was a traumatic event that shattered the confidence of a civilization that had believed to be unbreakable for over 2,000 years. The Assyrians were ruthless conquerors who showed no respect for the traditions and religious beliefs of Egypt. They erected temples, destroyed monuments, and drove tens of thousands of Egyptians to other parts of their empire. Tahara managed to regain control of southern Egypt and made several attempts to reconquer the north, but it turned out that the Assyrians were too powerful. His successor, Tenu-Tiamani, made his last attempt to drive out the invaders in 663 BC, but was decisively defeated. The Nubian pharaohs were forced to retreat to their homeland, Sultan, where they continued to rule an independent kingdom for 1,000 years. With the disappearance of the Nubians, the Assyrians were confronted with the issue of governing Egypt, a task beyond their capabilities. This country is too vast, too far from the center of the Assyrians, and too culturally unique to be effectively managed as a province. Instead, the Assyrians chose to rule through local Egyptian nobles who were willing to cooperate with Pharaohs in exchange for limited autonomy. Among these collaborators, the most successful one is the Pharaoh Sami-C, a prince from the western delta, a city of Sisi. Sami-K was originally a ship of the Assyrians. However, in the middle of the 7th century BC, as the power in Syria began to decline, he gradually advocated for his independence. Through the combination of diplomacy, military power and Greek mercenaries, Styx successfully unified Egypt under his rule and established the 26th dynasty, also known as the Sartri dynasty. King Asaph reigned from 664 BC to 525 BC and presided over the great revival of Egyptian civilization. They consciously imitated the pharaohs of ancient kingdoms, reviving the ancient artistic styles, religious customs and administrative systems. This safe renaissance is not merely nostalgia. This is an intentional attempt aimed at reconnecting with Egypt's glorious past and restoring the country's confidence. Sucked in and his successors were all skilled rulers who understood that the survival of Egypt depended on adapting to the reality of the constantly changing world. They welcomed foreign merchants and mercenaries, established trading posts throughout the Mediterranean, and built Egypt's first true navy. They also advocated the worship of sacred animals, especially the apis gethl in Memphis and the sacred cats in Bubastis, to emphasize Egypt's unique cultural identity. Remarkable achievements were made in art and architecture during the Site period. With its exquisite decoration and innovative architectural features, it rivals the great tombs of the New Kingdom. The bronze sculptures of this period, especially the sacred animal statues, represent the best metal works in Egyptian history. The pharaoh also carried out major restoration projects, restoring monuments that had been damaged during the chaotic years of the Third Intermediate period. But perhaps the most significant achievement of the Holy Dynasty was the creation of a new Egyptian identity that could survive foreign conquests and cultural changes. The holy pharaohs understood that Egypt's strength lay not only in military power or economic wealth, but also in cultural traditions and religious beliefs. By reviving and promoting these traditions, they created an Egyptian nationalism that could persist for a long time, even after the fall of their dynasty. In 525 BC, when the Persian king Cambyses conquered Egypt and incorporated it into the Persian Empire, the Renaissance of saints came to an abrupt end. His conquest was swift and decisive. The last time Pharaohsandpyramids was seen, he was defeated in the Battle of Palusim and captured in Persia, where he was eventually executed. The Persian conquest marked the end of the Third Intermediate period and the beginning of the late period of Egyptian history. For the next centuries, Egypt was ruled by foreign empires. First the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. The era of the independent Egyptian pharaohs came to an end, although there was a brief period of indigenous rule before the 4th century AD. When we look back at the Third Intermediate stage, what we see is a civilization that was tested to the limit but ultimately survived. The political division for an invasion and cultural decline during this period might have destroyed a less resilient society, but Egypt's basic systems, administrative system, religious hierarchy and cultural traditions proved powerful enough to withstand the most severe challenges. The Third Intermediate period also demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of Egyptian civilization. The Nubian pharaohs demonstrated that Egyptian culture could be adopted and adapted by foreign rulers who truly respected its traditions. The ruins of the pharaohs prove that Egypt can learn from the past while adapting to reality. Even under foreign rule, Egyptian scribes, priests and artisans continued to preserve and disseminate the cultural heritage accumulated over more than 2,000 years. Most importantly, the model established during the Third Intermediate period will become a feature of Egyptian history. A tension between local traditions and foreign influences, the significance of cultural identity and maintaining social cohesion, and the role of religion in maintaining continuity during periods of political change. All these themes will continue to shape Egyptian civilization until the end of the Pharaonic period. The Third Intermediate stage is coming to an end, but its lessons will last forever. Egypt has come to realize that political independence cannot be guaranteed, foreign rule is not necessarily permanent, and cultural identity can even withstand the most severe challenges. In the following centuries, when the Egyptians faced new conquerors, new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate the enduring power of their ancient civilization, these lessons were very helpful to them. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BC marked the beginning of the later period, which was the final chapter of Pharaoh's long story of Egypt. From 525 BC to the death of Cleopatra, in 30 BC, Egypt was mainly ruled by foreign powers, the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans, who transformed this ancient kingdom into a province of a vast multi-ethnic empire. However, this period of foreign rule is not merely a story of decline and decay. The cultural achievements, religious innovations and artistic revivals of this period demonstrated the enduring vitality of Egyptian civilization. Even under foreign rule, Egypt remained Egypt, an independent land, a civilization that could absorb foreign influences while maintaining its fundamental characteristics. The Persian conquest was led by Cambi Xcii. Sino, the son of Cyrus the Great, had already conquered most of the ancient Near East. The Persians were experienced empire builders who understood that successful governance needed to be in line with local traditions and beliefs. Unlike the Assyrians who ruled through terror and sabotage, the Persians usually respected the customs of their subjects and allowed them considerable autonomy in religious and cultural affairs. According to traditional Egyptian rituals, Ramses himself was crowned pharaoh and he offered sacrifices to the Egyptian gods in Egyptian temples. However, later Egyptian sources, especially the works of the priest Manetun, depicted Tammuz as a deranged tyrant who killed the sacred ape Piscatal and committed other blasphemous acts. These descriptions might have been propaganda aimed at legitimizing the later rebellion against Persian rule, but they reflected the deep resentment of many Egyptians towards foreign rulers. The Persian dynasty, known as the 27th dynasty, lasted from 525 BC to 404 AD. During this period, Egypt was ruled by Persian governors who were accountable to the great king and Pip-Wilos. The Persians maintained the traditional administrative structure of Egypt, using Egyptian officials and scribes to collect taxes and maintain order. Darius I was one of the most outstanding Persian rulers in Egypt. His reign over Egypt lasted from 522 BC to 486 BC. Darius was a great builder and manager who undertook significant construction projects in his empire. In Egypt, he completed a canal connecting the Nile River and the Red Sea. This project was initiated by Pharaoh Nicole II. This canal was the predecessor of the modern Suez Canal, promoting trade between Egypt and the Persian Gulf and demonstrating the Persians' commitment to the development of Egypt's economy. Darius also ordered the construction of a magnificent temple of Ammon in the Kola Oasis in the western desert. This temple was built in the traditional Egyptian style, but funded by Persian resources, symbolizing the complex relationship between foreign rulers and their Egyptian subjects. The Persians needed the cooperation of Egypt to govern the country effectively, while the Egyptians needed the resources of Persia to maintain their religious and cultural institutions. Despite these concessions, Persian rule was never fully accepted by the Egyptian people. The memory of independence remained strong, and several major rebellions broke out during the Persian period. The most serious one occurred in 460 BC, when a Libyan prince named Aros led an uprising that temporarily drove the Persians out of most of Egypt. The uprising was eventually suppressed with the help of the Athenian navy, but this indicated that the Egyptians' resistance to foreign rule remained strong. The Persian dynasty ended in 404 BC. Prince Amos from the delta city of Hades successfully rebelled against Persian rule and established the 28th dynasty. This marked the beginning of the last period of Egypt's independent rule, which lasted from 404 AD to 343 AD. The 29th and 30th pharaohs, under the reigns of Mendes and Sentos respectively, attempted to restore Egypt's feudality through military conquests and monumental architectural projects. Nectanebo-Oren and Nectanebo-Tun, the last two great native pharaohs of Egypt, built a large number of structures throughout Egypt and constructed temples in Karnak, Luxor, Idf and Dendera. The reliefs and inscriptions consciously imitate the style of the New Kingdom, reflecting their desire to link their rule with the past of the Egyptian Empire. These last native pharaohs also attempted to restore Egypt's international prestige by interfering in the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean. They supported the wars between Greek city-minor states and Persia, provided shelter for Persian rebels, and even attempted to reconquer Palestine and Syria. However, these ambitious foreign policies eventually proved to be counterproductive as they provoked the Persians to launch a new invasion of Egypt. In 343 BC, King Artaxerxes II of Persia conquered Egypt and established the 31st dynasty, which was the second period of Persian rule. The second Persian occupation was more cruel than the first one because the Persians were determined to prevent further rebellion. Temples were ransacked, the Egyptian nobles were expelled from the country, and the state was heavily taxed to fund Persian military operations in other places. The second Persian period was very short, lasting only until 332 BC, when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt as part of his resistance against the Persian Empire. Alexander's conquest was welcomed by many Egyptians, who regarded this young Macedonian king as a liberator free from Persian oppression. Alexander carefully respected the religious traditions of Egypt, offered sacrifices to the gods in the oasis of Sal, and consulted the oracle Ammon, who was said to be the son of the gods there. Alexander's most enduring contribution to Egypt was the establishment of the great port city of Alexandria, which later became the knowledge and commercial center of the Hellenistic world. Alexandria is located on the Mediterranean coast at the western edge of the Nile Delta. It was designed as a bridge between the Egyptian and Greek worlds and is an international city where Egyptian, Greek and other cultures can meet and interact. Alexander died before 323 AD, and his empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell into the hands of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's most trusted companions. He established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. Ptolemies are Greeks. They have retained their Greek identity while adopting the traditional roles of Egyptian pharaohs. The Ptolemaic period from 305 BC to 30 BC was one of the most culturally rich and complex periods in Egyptian history. The Tami people ruled in Alexandria, which became the largest city in the Mediterranean region and a learning center attracting scholars, artists and intellectuals from all over the world. The renowned Library of Alexandria was established by King Ptolemy and expanded by his successors. It was the largest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. It contains tens of thousands of scrolls, covering all fields of human learning, including literature, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine and geography. Scholars working in libraries have made pioneering discoveries and promoted the development of human knowledge in countless aspects. Pharaohs calculated the circumference of the Earth with great precision. Euclid developed the geometric principles that are still being taught today. Archimedes made fundamental discoveries in mathematics and physics. Hipparchus created the first precise catalogue of stars and discovered the process of the vernal equinox. Alexander Medical College has promoted the understanding of human anatomy and surgical techniques. But the Ptolemaic period was not just about learning Greek. This was also a period when Egyptian and Greek cultures merged significantly. The Tami people accepted the royal titles and religious customs of Egypt, built temples for the Egyptian gods and participated in traditional festivals. They also advocated the worship of Serapis, a new deity that combined Osiris from Egypt with Zeus from Greece, creating a god capable of attracting both Egyptian and Greek subjects at the same time. The art of the Ptolemaic period reflected this cultural synthesis. The Egyptian temples built during this period, such as Edfu, Dend-Ere and Feli, followed traditional Egyptian architectural principles, but incorporated Greek decorative elements. The famous Rosetta Stone was built during the reign of Temi-Th. Ur-F and contains the same Egyptian hieroglyphics, allegorical characters in Greek, symbolizing the multilingual and multicultural nature of Tmi Egypt. The most famous ruler of Tmi was Cleopatra VII, who reigned from 16 BC to 30 BC. Cleopatra was the first ruler to learn Egyptian and she actively promoted the culture and religion of Egypt. She believed herself to be the reincarnation of the goddess Is and used this religious identity to legitimize her rule and unite the Egyptians against the interference of the Romans. Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony was not only a romantic connection but also a political alliance aimed at maintaining Egypt's independence in the face of the increasingly powerful Roman forces. She understood that the survival of Egypt depended on finding powerful Roman protectors who could safeguard the kingdom from being conquered by other Roman generals. But Cleopatra's strategy ultimately failed. In 31 BC, after Antony and Cleopatra were defeated at the Battle of Arachin, Egypt was conquered by Octavian, who later became Augustus and incorporated into the Roman Empire. Cleopatra's suicide in 30 BC marked the end of the Icy dynasty and the Ionic Empire. The Roman conquest of Egypt was different from previous Pharaoh conquests. The Romans did not adopt the royal titles of Egypt, nor did they participate in the religious ceremonies of Egypt. On the contrary, they regarded Egypt as the private property of the Roman emperor, an important source of food and wealth that could not be entrusted to the Roman Senate or local governors. Under Roman rule, Egypt became the granary of the Mediterranean world, exporting millions of tons of grain every year to feed the population of Rome and other Roman cities. The Romans also made use of other resources in Egypt: gold from Nubia's gold mines, papyrus from delta swamps, and luxury goods on the Red Sea trade route. However, even under Roman rule, Egyptian culture continued to thrive in many aspects. The Romans, like the Persians and Greeks before them, found it necessary to adapt to the religious traditions and cultural customs of Egypt. Roman emperors are depicted on the walls of temples, dressed in traditional mythological royal power and offering sacrifices to the gods of Egypt according to ancient rituals. The great temples of Den-Dere, Edfu and Philae continue to serve as the religious and academic centers of Egypt. The Roman period also witnessed the rise of Christianity in Egypt, which would fundamentally change the culture and society of Egypt. According to tradition, Christianity was brought to Egypt by the Apostle Mark around 60 AD. This new religion found fertile ground among Egypt's diverse population, especially in Alexandria, where the Greek philosophical tradition laid the ideological foundation for monotheistic belief. Egyptian Christianity, known as Coptic Christianity, has developed its own unique characteristics, reflecting the country's ancient religious traditions. The Coptic Church emphasizes the divinity of Christ, drawing on the Egyptian concept of divine kingship and pharaoh god. Coptic monasticism originated in the Egyptian desert, and figures such as Saint Anthony and Saint Paul Ios had a profound influence on Christian practice around the world. Coptic is the final stage of ancient Egyptian, written in a modified Greek alphabet, and became the religious language of Christianity in Egypt. Coptic literature flourished during the Roman and Byzantine periods, giving rise to theological works, biographies of saints and translations of the Bible, preserving many aspects of ancient Egyptian thought and culture. The Roman period also witnessed the ultimate prosperity of traditional Egyptian religion. The Temple of Is and Philae was built during the Tammuz period and expanded under Roman rule, becoming the last major worship center in ancient Egypt. Pilgrims came to this sacred island from all over the Roman Empire. It is believed that the goddess Is reassembled the body of her murdered husband Osiris here. The priests of Philae were very faithful in maintaining the ancient tradition. Long after hieroglyphics were abandoned in other parts of Egypt, they continued to write in this script. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in Pharaoh in 394 AD, marking the end of a writing system that had been in use for over 3,000 years. However, this ancient religion gradually gave way to Christianity. In 313 AD, Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity within the empire. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become the official religion of Rome. The ancient temples were closed, their priests were dismissed, and their sacred ceremonies were prohibited. The transition from paganism to Christianity was not always peaceful. In 391 AD, a group of Christian writers destroyed the temple in Alexandria, which was one of the most magnificent temples in the ancient world. The renowned library of Alexandria had declined and was eventually abandoned because the Christian authorities showed little interest in preserving the pagan studies. However, the Christianization of Egypt also preserved many aspects of ancient Egyptian culture in new forms. Christian churches are usually built on the ruins of ancient temples, and the stones used come from even older buildings. Christian art incorporates traditional Egyptian symbols and patterns, endowing them with new Christian meanings. The ancient Egyptians' symbol of life, the cross, was transformed into the Christian cross. The image of Is nurturing the infant Horus influenced the Christian depiction of the Virgin in Mary and the infant Christ. During the Byzantine period from 303 AD to 641 AD, Egypt became increasingly isolated from the broader trend of Mediterranean civilization. The Coptic Church developed its own theological tradition, which often unconflicted with the official doctrine of Constantinople. Coptic gradually replaced Greek as the language of daily life and created a more unique Egyptian Christian culture. This isolation made Egypt vulnerable to attacks from new conquerors. In 641 AD, the Arab army led by Ammar ibn al-Ras conquered Egypt and incorporated it into the rapidly expanding Islamic Empire. The Arab conquest marked the end of the ancient world in Egypt and also the beginning of a new chapter in the country's long history. The Islamic conquest was relatively peaceful because many Egyptians welcomed the Arabs' liberation from the oppression of Byzantium. The Arabs allowed Christians and Jews to freely engage in their religious activities in exchange for paying a special tax, and they adopted many aspects of Egyptian administrative and agricultural practices. However, the Arab conquest also marked the end of Egypt. These ancient temples were either abandoned or converted into churches and mosques. Hieroglyphics were forgotten, and the historical and cultural knowledge of ancient Egypt was also lost. The Nile River still flows from south to north. The sun is still rising above the eastern desert. However, the civilization that had flourished along the river for over 3,000 years finally came to an end. When we conclude our historical journey through ancient Egypt, it is worth pondering what made this civilization so outstanding and enduring. From the unification of the Knolls around 3100 BC to the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC, over a period of more than 3,000 years, Egypt maintained its unique cultural identity and withstood the tests of conquest, foreign rule, religious unrest and social transformation. The secret to Egypt's longevity does not lie in its military power or economic wealth, although both were important at different times, but in its cultural resilience. The Egyptians developed a worldview that was both flexible enough to adapt to the constantly changing environment and stable enough to maintain continuity through centuries of change. They established systems such as the Pharaonic monarchy, the priestly hierarchy, and the scrivener schools, all of which survived political turmoil and foreign conquests. Most importantly, the Egyptians created a sense of identity rooted in their unique relationship with the Nile River and the land it nourishes. Whether they were ruled by their own pharaohs or foreign kings, whether they worshipped traditional gods or embraced new religions, Egyptians were essentially still Egyptians. They are the people of the Nile, the children of the black soil, and the inheritors of the civilization that achieved great accomplishments when the world was young. The monuments they built, the pyramids in Giza, the temples in Kuranake and Luxor, and the tombs in the Valley of the Kings still stand today, attest to their achievements. The art they created, the literature they wrote, and their scientific discoveries. For thousands of years after their creators returned to the dust, they continue to inspire and convey information to us. Perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient Egypt is that it provided an example for human potential. The Egyptians demonstrated that it is possible to create a civilization that is materially prosperous and spiritually rich, politically stable and culturally vibrant, and that is both rooted in tradition and willing to innovate. They proved that humanity can work together to achieve greatness, that they can create beauty more enduring than empires, and that they can devote wisdom and guide future generations. All the pharaohs have gone. The palace was reduced to ruins. Their empire has been reduced to dust. But the spirit of ancient Egypt endures forever. In those monuments that still inspire people's amazement, in those stories that still inspire our imagination, in the eternal desire of humanity to create something greater than itself, and in those things that can exist for a long time, even after our death. The Nile still flows from south to north, carrying the gifts of life through the desert, as it has for millions of years. The sun still rises from the eastern cliff and sets behind the western mountain, marking the passage of day and night, just as the ancient Egyptians did. Somewhere on a silent desert night, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the whispers of the past, the voices of scribes and priests, the voices of farmers and artisans, the voices of pharaohs and queens, all telling the same eternal story, a nation that dares to dream of immortality and achieve it in its own way. The story of ancient Egypt has come to an end, but its legacy is eternal. In every towering pyramid, in every revered and sacred temple, in every piece of art that captures beauty, and in every conservation action that commemorates the past, the spirit of ancient Egypt endures forever. If Pharaoh promised his people eternal life, to some extent, they fulfilled this promise. Ancient Egypt has perished, but it will never perish. It lies in our memories, in our imagination, and in our endless infatuation with a civilization. This civilization achieved great accomplishments when the world was young, leaving us an immortal monument. In the quiet darkness of your room, as ancient tales gradually blend into your gentle breathing rhythm, you should know that you are also a part of this eternal story. The stars that guide the builders of the pyramid shine upon you tonight. The human dream that drove the pharaoh to build eternal buildings still exists in your heart. Rest now. Know that the wisdom of generations flows in your dreams. When you wake up tomorrow, you will be the successor of the greatest civilization in the history of the world. Have a good sleep, child of the Nile. Your story is written on the stars.